The ice-cold wind bit through General George Washington's worn coat as he stood on the Pennsylvania bank of the Delaware River, watching his ragtag Continental Army huddle around dying campfires. It was the final days of December 1776, and the American Revolution hung by a thread so thin it seemed ready to snap at any moment. Behind him, over 2,000 men, farmers turned soldiers, merchants turned fighters, waited in the bitter cold, their enlistments set to expire with the dying year. Washington's weathered hands gripped the intelligence report that had arrived that morning. Across the icy Delaware, Hessian mercenaries occupied Trenton, celebrating what they believed was their inevitable victory over the colonial rebellion. The German soldiers, fighting for King George III's gold, had grown comfortable in their winter quarters, confident that no army would dare cross the treacherous river in such conditions. They were wrong. The general's piercing blue eyes surveyed the chunks of ice floating downstream like nature's own obstacles course. Every military manual would have called his plan madness, crossing a partially frozen river on Christmas night with an army that had known nothing but defeat for months. Yet Washington understood what his critics in the Continental Congress did not. Sometimes the most desperate gambles yield the greatest rewards. As documented by Mount Vernon historians, Washington had been planning this audacious strike for weeks, knowing that Washington hoped that a quick victory at Trenton would bolster morale and potentially convince some of his soldiers to extend their enlistments. The intelligence gathered by Captain Alexander Hamilton and other officers painted a clear picture of enemy dispositions. Roughly 1,400 Hessians, under Colonel Johann Rall, scattered across Trenton in what they assumed was secure winter quarters. Washington called his senior officers to a hastily arranged council of war in a farmhouse near McConkey's Ferry. General Nathanael Greene, his most trusted subordinate, studied the rough maps spread across the wooden table. The plan was elegantly simple yet incredibly risky. 3 separate crossings of the Delaware, with Washington leading the main force of 2,400 men directly against Trenton. While diversionary forces created confusion elsewhere, the room fell silent as Washington outlined the timeline. They would cross on Christmas night when the enemy would be least prepared, march 9 miles through hostile territory in darkness, and attack at dawn. General Hugh Mercer, a Scottish-born physician-turned-warrior, voiced what everyone was thinking: "George, if we fail, the revolution dies with us." Washington nodded grimly, then replied with words that would echo through history, that we shall not fail. Outside, the Continental soldiers began their preparations, checking their flintlocks and sharpening their bayonets. Many had no shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Their uniforms were little more than rags held together by determination and desperation. Yet something stirred among these men as word of the planned attack spread through the ranks, a sense that their young nation's survival depended on what they would do in the next 24 hours. As Christmas Day faded into night, Washington mounted his horse and surveyed his army one final time. The Delaware River stretched before them like a dark prophecy, its surface partially frozen yet treacherous enough to claim lives. Behind them lay a trail of defeats from New York to New Jersey. Ahead lay either redemption or destruction. The general raised his hand, and the first boats pushed off from the Pennsylvania shore. History itself seemed to hold its breath as the Continental Army began its most crucial gamble, a desperate crossing that would either save the American Revolution or witness its final frozen death throes in the icy waters of the Delaware. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead mariners worked with grim efficiency as they guided the Durham boats through the treacherous Delaware waters. These Massachusetts fishermen, weathered by years on the North Atlantic, were perhaps the only men in Washington's army capable of navigating the ice-choked river. On this bitter Christmas night of 1776, each boat groaned under the weight of soldiers, horses, and artillery pieces, while chunks of ice struck the hulls like nature's own cannon shots. Washington stood in the bow of the lead boat, his imposing 6'3" frame wrapped in a dark cloak that whipped around him in the howling wind. Behind him, General John Sullivan's division followed in a line of boats that stretched across the dark water like ghostly specters. The operation had begun at 6 o'clock in the evening, but the brutal weather was making progress agonizingly slow. Private Thomas McCarty of the 3rd Virginia Regiment later wrote to his sister, "About that hellish night, the sleet cut our faces like knives, and our hands froze to our muskets. But the general stood there like a rock, never showing fear, never complaining. If he could endure it, so could we." The crossing, originally planned to take 4 hours, stretched on through the night as boat after boat fought against ice, wind, and the growing certainty that they were already behind schedule by 3 o'clock in the morning. The last of Washington's main force finally reached the New Jersey shore, according to the American Battlefield Trust, after crossing the Delaware on December 25, 1776. George Washington embarked on a 10-day campaign that would change the course of the war, but Washington's troubles were only beginning. The other crossing points had failed entirely. General James Ewing's force at Trenton Ferry and Colonel John Cadwalader's men at Bristol had been turned back by the ice. The original plan called for a coordinated three-pronged attack, but Washington now faced the grim reality that his 2,400 men would have to assault Trenton alone. Worse still, dawn was breaking, and they were hours behind schedule. Any element of surprise seemed lost. Many of his officers urged him to abandon the attack and return to Pennsylvania, but Washington's jaw set with determination. "We have crossed the Rubicon," he declared, referring to Caesar's fateful decision that committed him to civil war. "There is no turning back." The 9-mile march to Trenton began in the pre-dawn darkness of December 26th. The Continental Army split into two columns, Washington and Greene taking the longer Pennington Road, while Sullivan's men took the River Road. The sleet continued to fall, turning the roads into treacherous sheets of ice. Soldiers slipped and fell, horses stumbled, and artillery wheels carved deep ruts in the frozen mud. Yet something remarkable was happening within the ranks. These men, who had endured defeat after defeat in New York and the retreat across New Jersey, began to find their fighting spirit again. The very audacity of their general's plan seemed to kindle a fire in their hearts. Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding a battery of artillery despite his youth, rallied his gunners with promises of warm quarters and hot food once they took Trenton. As the two American columns approached their target, Washington received word from his scouts that the Hessians appeared completely unaware of the approaching danger. Colonel Rahl, the German commander, had dismissed intelligence reports of American activity, confident that no army would dare attack in such weather. The Hessians had celebrated Christmas with considerable quantities of liquor, and many were still suffering the effects of their revelry. At 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26th, Washington's army reached the outskirts of Trenton. The general quickly deployed his forces. Greene's column would attack from the north, while Sullivan struck from the west. The artillery, commanded by Captain Hamilton and Captain Thomas Forrest, would seal off the streets and prevent enemy escape. After months of retreat and desperation, the Continental Army was finally ready to strike back. Washington drew his sword and looked at his officers gathered around him in the gray morning light. Ice crystals clung to their eyebrows and beards, and their breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. "Today, gentlemen," he said in a voice that carried across the ranks, "we begin to win this war." The Battle of Trenton was about to commence, and with it, the first step toward an even more crucial engagement that awaited them just days ahead at Princeton. The attack on Trenton began with the thunderous roar of American artillery echoing through the streets of the sleeping town. Captain Alexander Hamilton's guns, positioned at the head of King Street, opened fire just as the Hessian sentries realized the magnitude of their predicament. Within minutes, the cobblestone streets filled with confused German soldiers stumbling from their quarters, many still buttoning their uniforms as musket balls whizzed overhead. Colonel Johann Rahl, the Hessian commander, rushed into the street, wearing only his nightshirt and boots, desperately trying to rally his men. The professional soldiers who had terrorized American forces for months now found themselves caught completely off guard by an enemy they had dismissed as beaten. Washington's two-pronged assault compressed the Hessians into the center of town, where American artillery commanded every street and alley. The battle lasted barely an hour. Overwhelmed by the ferocity and coordination of the American attack, the Hessians attempted to form battle lines, but Sullivan's men poured into the town from the west while Greene's column pressed from the north. Colonel Rahl, mortally wounded while trying to organize a counterattack, was carried to a local church where he would die of his wounds. Of the 1,400 Hessians in Trenton, over 900 were captured, with fewer than a dozen American casualties. The psychological impact of the victory reverberated far beyond the small New Jersey town. For the first time since the Declaration of Independence, American forces had defeated professional European soldiers in open battle. The captured Hessian battle flags and military equipment were paraded through Philadelphia, providing concrete proof that the Continental Army could fight and win. More importantly, many soldiers whose enlistments expired on December 3rd or 1st agreed to extend their service. For 6 more weeks, news of Trenton's fall reached British headquarters in New York within days, sending shock waves through the high command. General William Howe, who had believed the rebellion effectively crushed, now faced the uncomfortable reality that Washington's army remained a viable threat. Lord Charles Cornwallis, who had been preparing to sail for England on winter leave, received urgent orders to march south from New York with 8,000 troops to restore British control of New Jersey. Cornwallis, one of Britain's most experienced generals, was both furious and embarrassed by the Hessian defeat. He had personally assured Howe that New Jersey was secure for the winter, and the loss of an entire garrison to what he considered a ragtag colonial militia was a professional humiliation he intended to remedy quickly. The Earl assembled a formidable force, seasoned regiments that had fought in Europe, crack grenadiers, light infantry, and cavalry units that had proven their worth in previous campaigns. Washington, meanwhile, faced a strategic dilemma. The victory at Trenton had bought time and boosted morale, but his army remained outnumbered and operating deep in enemy territory. Intelligence reports indicated that Cornwallis was approaching with overwhelming force. The sensible military decision would have been to withdraw across the Delaware and consolidate defensive positions in Pennsylvania. But Washington understood that purely defensive warfare would ultimately lose the Revolution. The Continental Congress needed dramatic victories to maintain support for the war, and European powers watching the conflict required proof of American military capability. Before considering intervention against Britain, the general made a characteristically bold decision. Rather than retreat, he would recross the Delaware and seek another engagement with British forces. On December 30th, 1776, Washington's army crossed the Delaware once again, this time marching toward Trenton to establish defensive positions. As documented by historians at Mount Vernon, this critical strategic decision led to key American victories in the Battle of Trenton in late 1776 and the Battle of Second Trenton and Princeton in early 1777. The general was essentially doubling down on his Christmas gamble, betting the Revolution itself on his army's ability to face Cornwallis in open battle. By January 1st, 1777, the Continental Army had fortified positions south of Trenton along the Sunpink Creek. Washington deployed his forces with characteristic skill, placing artillery to command the bridge approaches and positioning riflemen in concealed positions along the creek banks. But he knew these defensive lines could not hold indefinitely against Cornwallis's superior numbers. As the new year dawned, both armies prepared for what many believe would be the decisive battle of the American Revolution. Cornwallis approached from Princeton with 8,000 of Britain's finest soldiers, confident that he would finally crush Washington's rebellion once and for all. Neither commander could have imagined that the most crucial engagement lay not at Trenton, but in a small college town just 10 miles to the north, where the fate of American independence would be decided in less than an hour of desperate fighting. Lord Charles Cornwallis spurred his horse forward as his massive column of 8,000 British troops snaked through the frozen New Jersey countryside toward Trenton. The Earl's breath formed white clouds in the bitter January air as he consulted his pocket watch. It was the morning of January 2nd, 1777, and he was determined to crush Washington's rebellion before nightfall. Behind him marched some of Britain's finest regiments, the 17th Foot, the 40th, and the elite light infantry companies that had proven their worth on European battlefields. The British advance had been methodical and overwhelming. At Princeton, Cornwallis had left Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood in command of a garrison consisting of the 17th Regiment, elements of the 40th and 55th Foot, plus a troop of dragoons, roughly 1,200 men total. These were seasoned professionals who had fought in the 7 Years' War, and Mawhood was a capable officer who had earned his rank through battlefield competence rather than political connections. Meanwhile, Washington faced an increasingly desperate situation south of Trenton. His defensive positions along the Sunpink Creek were strong, but he knew they could not withstand a prolonged siege by Cornwallis's superior force. As British artillery began probing his lines, in the afternoon of January 2nd, the American general called an emergency council of war. The flickering candlelight in the cramped farmhouse illuminated the weathered faces of his most trusted officers, Greene, Sullivan, and the Scottish-born General Hugh Mercer. Gentlemen, Washington began, spreading a hand-drawn map across the rough wooden table. We face annihilation if we remain here, but I propose something that our enemy will never expect. His finger traced a route north from Trenton, skirting around Cornwallis's main force. "We will march tonight to Princeton and strike at their garrison, while Cornwallis wastes time battering empty trenches." The audacity of the plan left his officers momentarily speechless. They would have to slip away in darkness, march 18 miles over frozen roads, and attack a fortified position with an army already exhausted from weeks of campaigning. General Mercer, ever the pragmatist, pointed out the obvious risks. "George, if Cornwallis discovers our movement, we'll be caught in the open with no line of retreat." Washington nodded grimly that we must ensure he doesn't discover us until it's too late. The plan required perfect timing and no small amount of luck. A skeleton force would maintain the campfires and create enough noise to convince the British that the American army remained in position, while the main force crept away via back roads that local guides assured them would avoid British patrols. At midnight on January 2nd, the Continental Army began its most audacious maneuver yet. The soldiers wrapped their musket locks in cloth to muffle any sound, and wheels of artillery pieces were bound with rags to deaden their rumble on the frozen roads. Washington himself led the column, riding alongside Dr. Benjamin Rush, who had joined the army to witness what many believed would be its final battle. The march north proved to be a nightmare of ice, darkness, and exhaustion. Soldiers stumbled over frozen ruts and fell into ditches filled with ice-crusted water. Many had no shoes and left bloody footprints in the snow, while others bound their feet in rags torn from their tattered uniforms. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and several men collapsed from the cold, having to be carried by their comrades. Yet discipline held. These men had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and won at Trenton. They would not fail there. Commander, now, as dawn approached on January 3rd, Washington's army found itself approaching Princeton from the southwest via the Quaker Road, a back route that would bring them directly into collision with Mawhood's garrison. The general deployed his forces with characteristic precision. Sullivan would continue toward Princeton to attack the town itself, while Washington and Greene moved to cut off any British retreat. At this crucial moment, fate intervened in the form of Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, who had received orders during the night to march south with reinforcements for Cornwallis. Just as Washington's main column approached Princeton, Mawhood was leading 400 men of the 17th Regiment south on the post road toward Trenton. The two forces were about to stumble into each other in what military historians would later call a classic meeting engagement, neither side expecting battle. Both committed to movement when contact occurred. As recorded by the American battlefield Trust, culminating at the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 1777. Washington snatched victory from the jaws of defeat and proved his amateur army could defeat the British. The Battle of Princeton was a classic meeting engagement. Both sides stumbled into one another, and neither expected to fight. The stage was set for the most important small battle in American history, a confrontation that would determine whether Washington's revolution would survive to see another day. General Hugh Mercer, commanding the American advance guard, spotted the glint of British bayonets through the morning mist at approximately 8 o'clock. Behind him, Washington's entire army was strung out along the Quaker Road, vulnerable to attack if the engagement went badly. Ahead lay Mawhood's seasoned professionals, men who had never lost a battle and had no intention of starting now. The fate of American independence was about to be decided in the orchards and fields surrounding Princeton, where the small armies would clash with consequences far beyond their numbers. General Hugh Mercer raised his hand to halt the advance guard as the morning mist revealed the unmistakable scarlet of British uniforms moving through the orchard ahead. It was 8 o'clock on the morning of January 3rd, 1777, and the Scottish-born physician turned warrior found himself facing Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood's column of the 17th Regiment, 400 of Britain's most experienced soldiers marching south to reinforce Cornwallis. The collision was unexpected for both sides, but Mawhood reacted with the instincts of a professional soldier. His men immediately formed battle lines among the apple trees, their brown-best muskets glinting in the pale winter sunlight. The British colonel, mounted on his bay horse with his Tippet spaniels running alongside, quickly assessed the American force opposing him, roughly 350 men of varying experience, many still carrying the confidence from their victory at Trenton. Mercer deployed his brigade with practiced efficiency, positioning Captain Daniel Neal's battery of guns on a small rise while his infantry took cover behind a fence rail. The 61-year-old general, who had served as a surgeon in the Jacobite Rising of 1745, before fleeing Scotland for America, understood that speed and aggression were crucial in such encounters. His men needed to break the British line before Mahood could bring his superior training and discipline to bear. The initial exchange of musket fire crackled through the frosty air like deadly fireworks. Both sides were firing at close range less than 50 yards apart, and men began falling immediately. Captain Neal's artillery sent grapeshot tearing through the British ranks, but Mahood's veterans held their ground with a stoic courage that had made them the terror of European battlefields. The British colonel ordered his men to fix bayonets and prepare for a charge that would drive the Americans from the field. What happened next became one of the most controversial moments of the battle, as documented by battlefield historians. Lines of infantry blazed away at each other from a mere 40 yards, until finally the Redcoats launched a howling, furious bayonet attack, causing the Americans to break. American General Hugh Mercer fighting off the blows with his sword was bayoneted 7 times and left for dead. The British charge was devastating in its ferocity, with seasoned soldiers screaming as they drove forward with 18-inch steel blades. Mercer, recognizing that his line was breaking, attempted to rally his men by personal example. Drawing his sword, the aging general stood his ground as British soldiers swarmed around him. Witnesses later reported seeing him parrying bayonet thrusts with his blade, while shouting encouragement to his fleeing troops. But the odds were overwhelming. Multiple British soldiers surrounded him. As their bayonets found their mark again and again, the general fell mortally wounded, his blood staining the frozen ground beneath the apple trees. The collapse of Mercer's brigade sent shockwaves through the advancing American army. Men who had shown courage at Trenton now broke and ran as British soldiers pursued them. With fixed bayonets, Captain Daniel Neal tried desperately to save his guns, but the retreating infantry exposed his battery to British assault. Within minutes, Mahood's professionals had captured the American artillery and were preparing to turn the guns on Washington's main force, which was still approaching through the morning mist. Washington himself witnessed the disaster unfolding before him as he rode forward with the main body of his army. The sight of his men fleeing in panic while British soldiers advanced with captured American guns was exactly the kind of scenario that had haunted his nightmares. Since taking command of the Continental Army, if Mahood succeeded in rolling up the American flank, Washington's entire force could be destroyed piecemeal, ending the revolution in a single disastrous hour. But this was the moment that revealed Washington's true genius as a military commander. Rather than ordering a general retreat that would have preserved his army but doomed the revolution's morale, he made the most crucial decision of his career. Spurring his horse forward, the 6'3" general rode directly toward the British line, his blue uniform making him a perfect target for enemy marksmen. His aide-de-camp begged him to withdraw to safety, but Washington ignored all pleas for caution. Colonel John Fitzgerald, who witnessed the scene, later wrote, "I saw the general riding toward the British line as if he meant to charge them single-handed. The enemy was so close I could see the expressions on their faces. As they raised their muskets to fire, I thought surely we had lost our commander, and with him, the revolution." The image of Washington charging toward the British line became one of the most iconic moments in American military history, a supreme act of leadership that transformed potential defeat into ultimate victory. Behind Washington came General John Cadwalader's Philadelphia Associators and the remnants of other units that had witnessed Mercer's fall. These men, inspired by their commander's fearless example, reformed their ranks and prepared to advance against the British position. The battle for Princeton was reaching its climax, with the fate of American independence hanging in the balance. Among the blood-stained apple trees, where General Hugh Mercer had fallen in defense of his adopted country's freedom, the thunderous crash of musket fire echoed across the Princeton battlefield as George Washington spurred his white charger directly toward the British line. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood's veterans, who had just shattered Mercer's brigade, now found themselves facing the most extraordinary sight of their military careers: the commanding general of the Continental Army leading a personal charge against their position. Washington's imposing figure, sword raised high, became a lightning rod that drew every British musket in range. "Fire!" Mahood commanded, and a deadly volley erupted from the British line. Smoke billowed across the field as dozens of musket balls whistled through the air. Around Washington's horse, Colonel John Fitzgerald, riding behind his commander, later wrote that the smoke was so thick he lost sight of the general completely. When the gray cloud cleared, Fitzgerald expected to see Washington's body crumpled on the frozen ground. Instead, the general sat perfectly upright in his saddle, unharmed and calling for his men to advance. The psychological impact of Washington's survival was immediate and profound. The British soldiers, many of whom were superstitious men from rural England, began to whisper that their enemy commander possessed supernatural protection. More importantly, the Continental soldiers, who had been fleeing in panic just minutes before, now rallied to their general's example. Captain Hamilton brought up his artillery battery at a gallop, unlimbering his guns within 50 yards of the British line and opening fire with devastating effect. General John Cadwalader's Philadelphia associators, who had failed to cross the Delaware on Christmas night, now had their chance for redemption. These citizen soldiers, many of them prosperous merchants and artisans who had left comfortable lives to serve their country, formed battle lines with parade ground precision. Their uniforms were cleaner and their equipment better maintained than the Continental regulars, but they lacked combat experience. Today would test whether civilian enthusiasm could match professional military training. As Washington continued to rally his forces, the tactical situation began to shift dramatically. General John Sullivan's division, which had been marching toward Princeton via a parallel road, heard the sound of gunfire and immediately changed course to support the main battle. Sullivan's men, veterans of multiple campaigns, approached the British position from the flank, threatening to surround Mahood's increasingly isolated force. Mahood, despite being outnumbered and outflanked, maintained the composure of a professional soldier. He had won his commission through merit rather than purchase, and his experience in European warfare told him that retreat was now his only option if he hoped to preserve his command. The British colonel ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Princeton, where the remaining garrison could provide support in defensive positions. The running battle that followed stretched across the frozen fields and farm lanes leading to Princeton. American forces pressed the retreating British from three directions: Washington's reform line from the southwest, Sullivan's division from the northwest, and Cadwalader's men from due south. British soldiers, trained to fight in the rigid, linear formations that dominated European battlefields, found themselves struggling to adapt to the more fluid American tactics. Captain Hamilton's artillery proved particularly effective during the pursuit. The young New Yorker, who would later serve as Washington's most trusted aide and eventually become the first Secretary of the Treasury, demonstrated the aggressive leadership that would characterize his entire career. His guns kept pace with the advancing infantry, unlimbering to fire whenever the British attempted to form a defensive line, then quickly hitching up to continue the advance. The breakthrough moment came when Sullivan's flanking maneuver finally cut off the British line of retreat. Caught between converging American forces with no clear escape route, many of Mahood's men began to surrender rather than face annihilation. The sight of British soldiers laying down their arms had an electrifying effect on the American troops, who had endured months of defeat and retreat since the disasters in New York. Mahood himself managed to escape with approximately 100 men, fighting his way through American lines with the desperate courage of soldiers who knew their captor meant imprisonment or worse. The British colonel's personal bravery during the retreat earned him the grudging respect of his American opponents, who recognized a fellow professional soldier doing his duty under impossible circumstances. His Tibet spaniels, which had followed him throughout the battle, somehow survived the chaos and continued to run alongside their master as he led his remaining men toward temporary safety. As documented by the American Battlefield Trust, on January 3, 1777, Continental Army soldiers under the command of General George Washington defeated a force of British troops near Princeton, New Jersey. But the victory was far from complete. The British garrison still held Nassau Hall and other strong points within the town itself, and Cornwallis's main force was undoubtedly racing north from Trenton after discovering Washington's nocturnal escape. Washington, his uniform torn and stained with gunpowder, surveyed the battlefield where his army had just achieved its most significant victory since the Declaration of Independence. The cost had been high. General Mercer lay dying in a nearby farmhouse, and dozens of other brave men would never see their homes again. But the psychological impact of defeating British regulars in open battle was immeasurable. The Continental Army had proven it could fight and win against Europe's finest soldiers. As American forces regrouped for the final assault on Princeton, Washington knew that the next hour would determine whether this victory would be remembered as a turning point in the Revolution or merely a costly delay before ultimate defeat. Lord Cornwallis was certainly racing north with overwhelming force, and the American army was exhausted from their night march and morning battle. Everything now depended on capturing Princeton quickly and escaping before the British trap could close around them. The final phase of the Battle of Princeton began with one of the most famous artillery exchanges in American military history. As Washington's victorious forces approached the town center, approximately 194 British soldiers barricaded themselves inside Nassau Hall, the stone edifice that served as the main building of the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University. These were the remnants of the garrison that Mahood had left behind, seasoned professionals who intended to make the Americans pay dearly for every room. Captain Alexander Hamilton, still flushed with the excitement of his successful charge against Mahood's men, brought his battery into position facing the imposing colonial structure. The 20-year-old artillery officer, who had emigrated from the Caribbean just years before, understood that time was critical. Cornwallis would surely arrive soon with overwhelming force. Hamilton's guns opened fire on Nassau Hall with methodical precision, sending iron shot crashing through the tall windows and thick stone walls. According to battlefield historians, legend has it that one of his shots beheaded a portrait of King George II. Whether true or apocryphal, the story became part of American folklore symbolic of the Revolution's assault on royal authority. The psychological effect on the British defenders was immediate and devastating. These soldiers, who had expected to spend a quiet winter in comfortable quarters, now found themselves trapped in a building under direct artillery fire with no hope of relief. The bombardment lasted less than 10 minutes before white flags appeared at several windows. The British garrison, realizing their position was hopeless, chose surrender over annihilation. As American soldiers poured into Nassau Hall, they discovered not only military supplies and equipment, but also the college's library and scientific instruments, treasures of learning that would have been destroyed if the siege had continued. Washington personally ordered that no harm come to the academic materials, demonstrating the respect for education that would characterize his entire career. The complete American victory at Princeton sent shockwaves throughout the British command structure. In less than 2 hours of fighting, Washington's army had destroyed or captured most of Mahood's force, seized a well-equipped garrison, and demonstrated that Continental forces could defeat British regulars in open battle. The strategic implications were staggering. No British position in New Jersey could now be considered secure from American attack. But Washington knew that celebration was premature. His scouts reported dust clouds on the southern horizon, indicating that Cornwallis's massive force was approaching rapidly from Trenton. The American general faced a crucial decision. Should he fortify Princeton and risk a siege against overwhelming odds, or should he withdraw with his victory intact and preserve his army for future battles? The choice revealed Washington's strategic wisdom. He ordered an immediate withdrawal northward toward Morristown. The retreat from Princeton became almost as significant as the battle itself. Washington's army, exhausted from 36 hours of continuous marching and fighting, somehow found the strength to continue moving. They carried their wounded, including the mortally injured General Mercer, on improvised stretchers while maintaining military discipline despite their fatigue. The general himself rode among his men, offering encouragement and ensuring that no soldier was left behind. General Hugh Mercer died 9 days after the battle, succumbing to the 7 bayonet wounds he had received while trying to rally his broken brigade. His death became a rallying cry for American forces. Here was a man who had fled Scotland after the failure of the Jacobite Rising, found freedom in America, and died defending that freedom against another royal army. Mercer's sacrifice embodied the international character of the American Revolution and the diverse coalition fighting for independence. The strategic consequences of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate military results. European observers, particularly in France and Spain, began to reassess American prospects for ultimate victory. Benjamin Franklin, serving as American minister in Paris, used news of Washington's victories to argue for French intervention in the conflict. The Battle of Princeton, combined with Trenton, proved that American forces could sustain aggressive operations against professional European armies more immediately. The victory transformed the war in New Jersey. British and Hessian garrisons, which had controlled most of the state since Washington's retreat across the Delaware, now found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Many outposts were abandoned as commanders concentrated their forces in more defensible positions. The civilian population, which had been wavering in its support for the revolution, now saw evidence that American forces could protect them from British retaliation. Washington established winter quarters in Morristown, where the Continental Army could rest, refit, and recruit new soldiers. The strategic position in the New Jersey Highlands provided excellent defensive terrain, while threatening British communications between New York and Philadelphia. From Morristown, American forces could launch raids against enemy positions while remaining relatively secure from British counterattacks. The transformation of the Continental Army itself was perhaps the most important long-term consequence of Princeton. Soldiers who had endured the disasters of New York, the retreat across New Jersey, and the desperate crossing of the Delaware, now knew they could defeat the world's most powerful military. The psychological change was profound. These men were no longer colonial rebels hoping to avoid annihilation, but continental soldiers capable of fighting and winning battles against professional European armies. As 1777 dawned, the American Revolution had survived its darkest hour through the genius of George Washington and the courage of men who refused to surrender their dreams of independence. The small battle at Princeton, lasting barely 2 hours and involving fewer than 4,000 soldiers total, had demonstrated that the American cause was not only just but militarily viable. From the blood-stained orchards where Hugh Mercer fell to the halls of Nassau where Hamilton's guns proclaimed liberty, the Battle of Princeton had proven that a small engagement could indeed change the course of history. The British High Command in London received news of the Princeton defeat with growing alarm. King George III, who had confidently predicted the collapse of the American rebellion by spring, now faced the uncomfortable reality that his professional armies were being outmaneuvered by colonial amateurs. Parliament began to question the enormous expense of the American war, while opposition leaders like Charles James Fox used the defeats to attack Lord North's government. The political ramifications of Princeton would ultimately contribute to Britain's decision to seek peace negotiations 5 years later. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Washington's tactical brilliance became apparent to military observers on both sides of the Atlantic. His ability to escape from Cornwallis's trap, march 18 miles in darkness, fight a successful battle, and withdraw with his army intact demonstrated strategic thinking of the highest order. European military academies would later study the Princeton campaign as an example of how inferior forces could achieve victory through superior leadership and audacious planning. The human cost of Washington's victory was soberly calculated in the days following the battle. American casualties totaled approximately 40 killed and wounded, while British losses exceeded 300 including prisoners. But numbers alone could not measure the true price. General Hugh Mercer's death deprived the Continental Army of one of its most experienced officers, while dozens of young men from farms and cities across America would never see their families again. Yet their sacrifice had not been in vain. The victories at Trenton and Princeton transformed the American Revolution from a desperate rebellion into a viable war for independence. Foreign observers now took seriously the possibility of American success, while domestic support for the war increased dramatically throughout the 13 states. Most importantly, the Continental Army itself had been reborn in the crucible of battle, no longer the frightened, defeated force that had fled across New Jersey, but a confident military organization capable of facing any enemy. The legacy of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle demonstrated that citizen soldiers, properly led and motivated, could defeat professional armies fighting for pay rather than principle. This lesson would inspire democratic movements throughout Europe in the coming decades. As ordinary people realized that royal armies were not invincible, the American Revolution had become a beacon of hope for all who dreamed of freedom from aristocratic oppression. Washington himself emerged from Princeton as more than just a successful general. He had become the indispensable man whose leadership made American independence possible. His willingness to risk everything on audacious gambles, combined with his ability to inspire ordinary men to extraordinary courage, marked him as one of history's great military commanders. The image of the Virginia planter charging toward British muskets would become an enduring symbol of American determination and leadership. As the Continental Army settled into winter quarters at Morristown, the soldiers who had fought at Princeton carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than a mere battle. They had helped save the American Revolution at its moment of greatest peril, proving that a free people defending their homeland could overcome any obstacle. The small college town of Princeton had witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one in which citizen soldiers fought not for conquest or glory, but for the revolutionary idea that all men were created equal and possessed the right to govern themselves. The Battle of Princeton, though lasting only 2 hours and involving relatively few troops, had indeed meant everything for American independence. It transformed defeat into victory, despair into hope, and a struggling rebellion into a legitimate war for freedom that would ultimately create the United States of America.